I'm Bina Venkatraman. I'm the Boston Globe's editorial page editor. Welcome to this Op Talk. Op Talks, for the uninitiated, are conversations between Globe editorial board members and world-leading thinkers, surprising voices you may have never heard of before. In this case, it's a person you've definitely heard of, or if you haven't yet, you're in for a surprise treat. I'm so thrilled to welcome Errol Morris, who is a filmmaker of many, many films, including Academy Award-winning films. He's the author of numerous books. Hi, Errol. Welcome. Thanks for being part of an Op Talk.
Thanks for having me on.
So I know we're going to talk about...
Am I allowed to be one of my favorite people? So it's an honor.
It's mutual. This was basically an excuse to hang out. So now we're doing it just recorded and watched by who knows how many people. So we've got the panopticon looming over a catch-up. So we're going to talk about the relationship between images and reality, the relationship between images and history, and we use the pretense or the context of images of protest to sort of have a conversation that I know is going to go in many interesting directions. But I want to start with kind of the place and the moment we're in, because we're obviously experiencing this time in our history where camera footage from people's smartphones, from a teenager who documented the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, from smartphone photos and video footage that have shown other acts of police violence, are just having such a powerful impact on our politics and are really instigating social change. So it seems obvious. I know that you're outraged by this imagery. It's obvious to say that this imagery is making a difference. It's having an impact on public consciousness and awareness of systemic injustice and other problems in society. But I kind of want to juxtapose that with what I see as one of your deep insights, one of your many deep insights and wisdoms that you write about in Believing is Seeing, one of your books, which is that you say that photographs are like flypaper for false beliefs. I'm probably paraphrasing you ineloquently. That they attract false beliefs the way that flypaper attracts flies. So we know that images can have an impact and a power, but we also know that they can horribly mislead us. And I want to try, I guess, in this conversation to understand how we reconcile the power of imagery and also the kind of distortion it creates. Is that a good plan?
We also know that there's an enormous amount of slack between an image and reality. It's not as if you can just read reality off of a photographic plate. You're interpreting what you're looking at. And that interpretive exercise is part of the deal. One of the reasons that people are so, and I believe they are outraged by this alteration of photograph, part of the display at the National Archives. I mean, that's why, as I understand it, you originally came to me. My feelings about that photograph, and let me back up a bit.
Yeah, because I'll show the photograph when we're ready to talk about it, and we'll show a bit of a detail and we'll talk about it.
But I have, one of my crackpot theories, I suppose you could call it a crackpot theory, that the study of history is the study of the cover-up of history. That we learn as much, if not more, about history through attempts to cover it up, to elide it, to change it, to obscure it.
So that makes me think about Watergate, of course, and sort of the cover-up being worse than the original crime and showing us that there were serious problems in terms of checks on executive power. But what are you thinking of other examples when you say that the cover-ups are the true history?
There are myriad examples. But what is so interesting, this shouldn't be forgotten. in this story, what is so interesting is they took a photograph and they felt the need to alter it, to adulterate it, to obscure elements in the photograph. I suppose there's an attendant irony that this is the National Archive. This is an organization that is presumably dedicated to preserving history in some unadulterated form. And here they've gone and they've started to fuzz out elements of a photograph that's on public display.
All right, I'm going to show the photograph. I'm going to show the original photograph just in case people have not seen it. And so this is Mario Tama's original photograph of the Women's March in 2017 that followed President Trump's inauguration day. And this was not the version showed in the National Archives. We know that there were images blurred out where there were negative statements about the president or women's genitalia named in the images. So, and here's an example of that. So we see God Hates Trump fuzzed out in the version that the National Archives put into its exhibition about women's suffrage and sort of drawing a line from the early 20th century to today. So Errol,
but that's not all they blurred out, of course. They blurred out Trump. Do you have other examples that you could show?
I don't have them right here at the moment, but you're right. They blurred out other examples. So here's the God Hates Trump. If I can find some of the others. The National Archives didn't I remember images from those protests like "This pussy grabs back," kind of just riffing off of that Hollywood Access video and what had been learned about the president's views of women. And so a lot of those kind of signs, it seems, were targets for the archive. And so,
but one of the signs was, if my pussy could shoot bullets, it would be less regulated. Something to that effect. And that, of course, was sanitized as well. What fascinates me in all of this is clearly the need to do it. They felt the need to do it because why? They did it. I mean, they changed this photograph that was put on display. And I would imagine for a whole number of different reasons. And of course, since articles were written in newspapers about the adulteration of this photograph, what really is interesting is the excuses they made for doing it. You're talking to an archivist, and what is his excuse for adulterating a photograph? My favorite of the excuses? Well, you wouldn't want an exhibit to be quote unquote politicized. Really? You wouldn't want this Women's March, which was in many ways a protest march against Donald Trump, who had just been elected the 45th president of the United States. You wouldn't want it to have political content, would you? Really? Well, what would you want it to have? You're going to strip it of all political content? That's insane. And why would an archivist feel the need to depoliticize a political moment? I think the answers are so obvious and so sad. Maybe nothing is obvious. I do have this expression that nothing is so obvious that it's obvious. Maybe it's not obvious at all why they did it, but my guess, my guess is that it's done out of fear. There's a crazy president who likes to fire people who disagree with him.
Well, what I think is fascinating is that, at least from what the news reports show and the interviews with the National Archives leadership around this image, that they weren't explicitly told to do this, that it was a form of self-censorship.
Yeah,
And
even sadder.
so it's an extreme example, I think, of altering an image, trying to, and in effect, in altering the image, altering history, because this is the National Archives. If you put something in the National Archives, the mission of which is to help civilians understand their own history and their democracy. So it's an extreme example, but I mean, you write about and think about other ways in which people manipulate and alter photographs that are less, I guess, less necessarily incriminating or egregious. And you even argue that when a photographer chooses to frame an image and what they keep in and out of that image is a form of, let's say, altering history or manipulating reality. So how do you distinguish between the act of a photographer who, or a documentarian for that matter, who is ostensibly trying to capture history and leave some things out, and what happens in this kind of sort of extreme circumstance?
History always leaves things out. The mistake is to assume that photography is capturing objective reality. The choices aren't being made, that things aren't being left out. History is a long, involved process of leaving things out, not including things, omitting things, eliding things, abbreviating things. What's interesting about this exercise, and I wasn't sure that this was interesting, but I changed my mind. Because if history is the elision of history, if that's really what it is, the photograph gives us an opportunity to do what we're doing here right now, and to discuss the relationship of the photograph to reality, which is what we should do whenever we look at a photograph. It's fantastic. Thank you. And what we see is not only the adulteration of the photograph, but the inquiries into why the photograph was adulterated. Why'd you do this, sir? You, director of the National Archive, why'd you do this? And if the answer is, well, the National Archive doesn't want to politicize, I'm going to do the air quotes, even though I hate air quotes, I'll do them anyway.
Stop with the air quotes, no air quotes.
The National Archive doesn't want to politicize their images. What does that tell you, that line? I may be quoting him incorrectly, but I think that's the essence of it.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think it speaks to your point about the cover-up telling you more about history. So if history, so the Washington Post broke this story about the exhibition having obscured the images, altered the images of the protest signs. And so if this moment of that alteration, right, maybe the exhibition itself wouldn't have been, even if it were in the archives, history, of course, of that exhibit, it might not have been remembered very well, or might not have been a notable exhibit in any way. But because of the exposure of this manipulation, to your point, it's the cover-up that tells you something about what it is to be a public servant, what it is to be working in government in the Trump administration, that perhaps ought to be part of the history.
It is part of the history. And in our own small way, we're making it part of the history.
All right, that's meta. But what's interesting too is sorry, what?
It's all meta.
Right. So So you wrote about in Believing is Seeing. Okay, I'm just going to plug
I
this
want
up.
to pursue this. Put that down.
Okay, because I love the book.
Right down.
All right. All right.
What do you think the head of the National Archive was thinking when he said, we don't want to politicize our exhibits? I'm sorry to ask you these questions, but I'm interested.
Well, I worked in government for a little while, not with this president, under the previous president, and particularly in the civil service, in the agencies, people who are not presidential appointees, so down into the ranks of these agencies, I think, there's a desire to be seen as apolitical that permeates, I don't think is unique to the Trump administration. So that part of it, in terms of, trying not to rile up whatever White House is in power, exists within the agencies as a sort of cultural mindset of the bureaucracy. But this to me, right, like this just goes so far beyond what a reasonable civil servant would do under a reasonable administration, to the extent that it actually, the action wasn't like avoiding saying something to, so if a Washington Post reporter or a Boston Globe reporter called up the National Archives and asked an archivist or asked the head of the archives, what do you think about President Trump? And the archivist or the bureaucrat decided to say, I will not offer comments on that. That would be an example of a reasonable approach to not antagonizing the political office and power as a civil servant who works across different administrations and tries to stay out of the political fray. But the actual mission of the archives is to preserve history as it happens. So that's why, the emails that Hillary Clinton sent that people could not get over, one of the reasons that people thought that was a big deal, so there were some people who made a big deal out of it and said this is, in a non-secure way to send national security related State Department emails. But the real reason that people who work in government want those emails to be in government email is because they're part of the National Archives. They go in the public trust for future generations to be able to consult those communications. And I think while that was not a disqualifying thing in terms of her candidacy for the presidency, that is actually the more important concern. And so I think the archives themselves need to be thought of in a way that is about that mission. It needs to be about the truth. Frankly, that's what journalism is about. Frankly, that's what your work is about, is trying to imperfectly approximate the truth. And as we're talking about, the images, even images that are not altered, are never perfect at that. That's what I think. I'm supposed to be interviewing you. I knew this would happen though. So,
Inevitable.
Yeah.
That's what I do. At least on occasion, I interview people.
Right. But we don't have the Interrotron right now. So, so it's a bit different. It's a bit unique. Should we look at some more pictures?
Well, I still want an answer. So the head of the National Archive, when interviewed about why he did this, when he said he did not want to politicize the exhibit, basically, is he telling, no, you worked in government, you know about this stuff far better than I do? Is he just acting out of fear?
I think it's fear. Yeah, I think it's self-censorship driven by fear, maybe not explicit fear of losing one's job. I think it may be as material and as sort of transactional as that. I don't know the guy. I don't necessarily want to imagine his state of mind, but I think that this administration has shown enough on numerous occasions. I mean, look at what's happening in the Justice Department. Loyalists are rewarded. Roger Stone is rewarded with a weaker sentence. Michael Flynn is rewarded with charges being dropped against him. And detractors, people who speak out, people who are critics of this president, are punished and in numerous ways. In Lisa Page, you know, in the public sphere, there, it's not just punished in terms of losing jobs. Sometimes it's public embarrassment, which, you know, because of the polarized world we're in, might later lead to a book deal if you're ostracized by this president. But I think there are a lot of public servants who don't want the book deal. They just want to do their job.
There are attempts to humiliate people in public. They're set up for ridicule, sometimes for clearly defamatory attacks of one kind or another. I'm not even going to say that it's unique to this administration, but it's certainly a characteristic of this administration. So you have an archivist, I believe, acting out of fear. You didn't ask me, but I'll ask myself. What do you think, Mr. Morris? I'm acting out of fear. He's afraid that somehow he is going to be criticized, and he's going to try to avoid that possible criticism by sanitizing his exhibit. How do I feel about it? Are you familiar with the term contempt?
Yes, I've heard of that term.
Indeed. I feel contempt. I feel it's a public servant not doing his job. And what annoys me even more is the justification for the cover-up. That tells me everything I need to know. The fact that the photograph was covered up, sure, happens all the time. It happens every time someone frames an image. They frame it to the left or they frame it to the right to include or exclude material. But when something like this happens and you're called on it, you say, excuse me, sir, this image was sanitized in your exhibit. Why? Why did you do it? And there are several examples. One of them, of course, is just removing Trump's name from a placard. God forbid that the name should appear in a demonstration against Trump. Perhaps we should rewrite all of the placards and slogans, have everybody wearing MAGA hats in the women's protest. I think not. The other interesting thing is what I would call Bowdlerization or Bowdlerization of images. One of my very favorite characters in history is Thomas Bowdler, who felt that women and children should not be subjected to the nasty language in Shakespeare. And so he took all the nasty bits out and published the Bowdlerized Shakespeare. Shakespeare sanitized for women and children who wouldn't have to be exposed to nasty sexual innuendo and sexual references.
You know how widely that was read? I mean, was that a collection that was actually widely distributed?
Yes, famous. Or at least it was famous in early Victorian times and probably throughout the 19th century, yes.
Yeah.
I first found out about it, one of my heroes, Bertrand Russell. I was trying to make alimony payments, and he wrote this book called Nightmares of Eminent Persons, which I recommend to everybody, a series of nightmares, joke nightmares. And of course, one of them was Dr. Bowdler's nightmare, how Dr. Bowdler's wife, when he's away, sneaks in to his office, his living room office, pulls a ladder to the top of one of his bookshelves and starts to read the unbowdlerized Shakespeare. So there's a whole kind of puritanical element here. It makes it almost, not almost, it makes it totally bizarre that women who are making references to attempts to control their bodies. Isn't this part of the demonstration against this administration? The fear that they're going to appoint anti-Roe justices and that Roe v. Wade will be overturned? Women objecting to this idea, because after all, it is their bodies. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
That is accurate.
That is accurate, thank you. That in this demonstration, they would take that out too. Maybe the National Archive does not want to, not only do they not want to politicize this demonstration, they don't want to sexualize it either. A demonstration by women about women's rights, they don't want to sexualize it.
It is very Victorian as you talk about it that way. It does strike me as a little bit Victorian. So if the
I would use a different word, Bina. I would say it's insane.
Fair enough. So if we had a contemptometer for you, Errol, if we had Errol's contemptometer, I think your contempt for the actions of the National Archives would be pretty far at the contempt heavy end of the spectrum. Am I right?
Yeah, you're right.
I'm wondering about.
I think this kind of behavior is ubiquitous. People are always changing things, altering things, expurgating things. That's what we do. You know,
yeah.
we lie to ourselves, we lie to other people, we try to manipulate. What have I learned from this administration? And I've learned a lot. I wish I had learned nothing of what I've learned. We see every single day people reacting to stuff which seems so clearly bad. Not bad in the African-American sense, really just plain bad in the ordinary English sense. And yet people see them in completely different ways. I've never seen anything like it. And each day, for me, it's my disagreement with Eleanor Roosevelt. I'd rather curse the darkness than light a candle.
All right. I do want to talk about the sort of maybe more minor infractions or areas where you might have less contempt, but the images have still been altered. And so one of the things you've written about is the Farm Security Administration's photograph propaganda campaign during the Dust Bowl. This is FDR era, Depression era photographers like Dorothea Lange, who were documenting the hardships of America. And you wrote about this series of photographs, which I don't have because I'm just riffing here, with the steer's skull being strategically placed in arid landscapes of the United States to show the stark realities of this time. And so what do you make? Do you find that, is that not incriminating? It's also the government in some way manipulating images for a purpose, but do you find that, is that not, does that even rank on the contemptometer? Does that stir you up, or is this not something we should worry about?
No, it's the same kettle of fish. A photograph should be the start of an investigation, not the end of it. A photograph should cause us to ask questions. For me, often questions about how the photograph was taken, what the intentions behind the photograph might have been, but even more important, contextualizing the photograph, trying to understand better the circumstances around the photograph. That stuff which has been sliced off by the frame, left to right, top to bottom. And this seems to be, I mean, it does really, when I was first shown this photograph, I keep going back to the National Archive because it does interest me. I kept thinking, well, this is obvious. Reminding myself once again that nothing is so obvious that it's obvious. This is obvious. Of course, photographs are always changed, or always interpreted, reinterpreted, misinterpreted, used as propaganda in one form or another. But what we need to do is to endlessly interrogate the images that are in front of us, to try to come to an understanding, a better understanding of what they mean. And that's what you're doing here.
That's what I'm trying to do, and you're making it possible. And I think it's important because, you know, here we are at this news organization and we put out images. So I'm gonna show another image. We put out images all the time to the public, you know, and we present them. And
why don't we interview the head of the National Archive together, or I'll do it.
Oh, that could be great. Let's do that. That should be the next one of these. And now what I'm trying to do is go forward to another image here.
Do you think God hates Trump?
You know, I haven't talked to God recently, so I'm going to reserve judgment on that. So here's an image from a Globe photographer of from the recent protests. Talented Globe photographer Matthew Lee, of a burning police car, and we know, you know, this is it's a powerful image, and the person in the image is unnamed, but it goes in our coverage, you know, of those protests, and you can see some graffiti on the police car. And I'm just wondering, you know, help us in the media, since we have this role. And, you know, every day I'm looking at our pages and we attach images to our opinions and letters and so forth. This happened to be from the newsroom side, which reports to Brian McGrory. But, you know, what should we be asking our readers to think about as they look at images that even we put out? Or should we be doing something different in terms of how we caption an image? You know, the caption of this image was, a police car burns, something along the lines of an unnamed man in front of a police car burning. You know, this is after what were largely peaceful protests did take a turn for the worse a couple of weeks ago.
Here's what I would love to see. Posting an image and then making an attempt to contextualize that image by talking to the photographer, or to people who might be in the image or around the image, to better understand what we're looking at. I think that in itself would be incredibly interesting. I was asked, it's years ago now, I didn't have the time to do it. This was at a time when police cameras were first coming into existence, body cameras. Made by a company in Arizona. I believe it's the same company that makes tasers. Body cams and tasers. A growth industry. I should have gone into it. And the idea, what was the idea behind police body cameras? Because, well, I should ask you again, but I'll volunteer something and you can correct me. What's the idea behind police body cameras? It would be a way of keeping the police honest. There would be a record of what they had done or what they hadn't done, how they had behaved, how they had not behaved, and so on and so forth. Well, in the 10 plus years, the body cams have been not ubiquitous, but they're more and more part of stories about the police. What have we learned? And I think this is another instance where the cover-up tells you more than the original story. Because, and I've now viewed so many, because I'm writing about it and planning to make a film about it. Yes, I'm interested in visual imagery and in photography, the effect that body cameras have had on this whole issue of cop killers. of policemen who have killed people.
Oh, okay. Because when people say cop killers, I think they sometimes mean something else, but
Yes.
got it.
Well, I made a movie, The Thin Blue Line, years ago about a person who killed a cop. This is a little different. These are stories about police officers who shot and killed people, and it was recorded with a body cam, or was recorded by a person who was on the scene with a phone camera. Sorry if I digress, I'll do this quickly. Years ago, I made a film about Abu Ghraib. And this is an instance where photography played an enormous role in the story. Everyone saw these photographs, and indeed, many of these photographs became iconic photographs. Why? Because they were ubiquitous. They were shown and reshown and reshown. The hooded man on the box with wires, Sabrina Harmon posed over a dead prisoner with a thumbs up and a smile. These are photographs that became endlessly controversial and endlessly shown. And I became fascinated by them. The head of the prison at Abu Ghraib tried to destroy all the cameras and to burn all the, I think he imagined that there was film. There was no film. They were digital cameras. And he couldn't destroy everything because he didn't quite understand. These were images being shown all over the world in not just hundreds of copies, but literally billions of copies. There was no way to just simply hide that piece of evidence. And it's changed since then. That is the watershed moment, I think, in photography and history, when photography becomes almost ubiquitous.
Right, and in a sense, almost citizens are surveying the police instead of, right, it's sort of the reversal of Foucault or something, with citizens with cameras watching the police now, and law enforcement and government. So I want to, we could talk forever. Time is flying though, and we don't have you forever. And I want to invite, we have some audience questions that my colleague, Abdullah Fayyad, is going to share with us. Abdullah, but let me whenever you feel like it. Abdullah is about to join the Globe editorial board. As of Monday, he will be an opinion writer in Globe Opinion. So we're delighted to have him. He was just at the Atlantic and has been on the streets of DC actually covering a lot of the protests there.
Thanks, Bina, and thanks, Errol, again for doing this. Like Bina said, I just have a couple questions from the audience that I'd like to ask you. And the first one was something you already mentioned, talking about contextualizing the photographs for future generations to be able to better understand what they mean. And so one audience member asks, what steps can citizens or journalists or both take to prevent the revisionist manipulation of photos and videos?
Nothing.
I mean, you do stuff. I mean, you're a documentarian. You've made, you write, you're an author. You can't do nothing. Why do you do what you do?
You're asking me what can you do to prevent photographs from being misinterpreted or biased?
Yeah.
It's the very nature of recording the world. But we can ask questions about them. We can, I just mentioned the existence of all of these now records of police killings. I was going to say police brutality, but in this instance, police killings. Police officers, whether it's warranted or unwarranted, shooting and killing somebody. And when body cams were first proposed, I believe there was this naive idea, and it is a deeply naive idea, that it would settle everything. Oh, we'll just look at the body cam material and it will tell us exactly what happened and what to think. And guess what? It hasn't worked that way, because people's capacity to reinterpret, to deny, is unfettered. Human beings are lie-generating machines. That's what we do best. Not record reality, but efface it. Otherwise, we probably couldn't go on existing. Sorry.
But Errol, isn't your work, I mean, you brought up The Thin Blue Line, which is this movie you made in the 80s about the killing of a police officer in Texas. And the way you made that movie, you were actually criticized by sort of purist documentarians, if I'm remembering this right, and you didn't get an Academy Award for that one, though you've gotten them since then. And the reason being that you used this technique of reenactments, which then you took to a whole new level with your Wormwood series, with actually having actors act out historical events in different versions. And the reenactments that you use in Thin Blue Line, you will show the same scene, the scene of the police officer being killed, as told by different so-called eyewitnesses, and you show different versions of events as reenactments. And so isn't that in a way an answer to Abdallah's question? Because isn't part of what you try to do with your work to expose the problems with the way people see things and the problems with the imagery itself, and the fact that you as the viewer might watch one version of that reenactment and believe that to be true, but then suddenly Errol Morris, the director, is presenting you with yet another reenactment that's a different version of events?
Yes, thank you. It's really me trying to figure out what's out there in the world. I never finished my essay on epistemology, taking the piss out of epistemology, but it's trying to figure out what's out there on the basis of evidence. Don't get me wrong, I think body cams on cops is a good thing. Why? Because it provides additional evidence of what may have transpired. But given that evidence, we then have to think it through. We have to examine it. We have to try to figure out what the evidence tells us about the world around us.
Well, this is a good point to move into the next question, which...
I don't answer your question if I've been bad.
You kind of answered it. It was helpful. It was helpful.
Interesting, at least.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Abdallah, what else do we have?
The other question, I know we're running out of time, so this is probably the last question I'll ask you from the audience, but someone is asking, how can you as a white person, so how can white photojournalists contribute to the movement to end systemic racism? And what specific anti-racist behaviors can white photographers exercise?
I have little idea, except that we're all today, not just African Americans, but everybody, is asking questions about cops who have killed people, and in particular, cops who have killed African Americans, and even more in particular, white cops who have killed African Americans. It's all part of an ongoing inquiry, which I think is a really, really important thing that's now going on in the world that I would like to be part of. Because guess what? I too look at these images and I look at these stories, and I'm really angered. They've made me really, really angry and depressed, because I, for whatever godforsaken reason, still believe in this country. And it hurts me when I see things that seem so deeply wrong and against the spirit, at least what I take to be the spirit of our democracy, such as it is. I think asking questions about what's going on in the world. I mean, why all of a sudden are we being exposed to these dreadful stories? What do they mean? Recently, someone asked me, do you think Chauvin will be convicted? Because I'm witness to a video that seems clearly to describe a murder, to record a murder. Well, what's going to happen? Will this case, like so many others, be just thrown out? Will there be no conviction? Will things just go on as usual? And I can speak for myself. If there's anything that I personally can do to examine, to interrogate these stories, I'm going to do it. I feel it's my responsibility. I just hate it. I hate the fact that it's going on. I hate the fact that no one does anything about it, and that's changing, and I would like to be part of that change.
Great. Well, I think we're running up against the clock, so Bina, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Abdullah, and sorry for all the people whose questions, sorry to all the people whose questions went unanswered. We'll have to do this again, I think, Errol. This just went by too quickly and there's too much to talk about. But if I can ask you a sort of closing question that just follows up on what you were talking about.
Maybe one example from Dr. Bowdler, which I found.
Yes, I'd love to hear.
Yeah.
What Dr. Bowdler did. I was curious.
This is Iago in Othello. I am one, sir, that comes to tell you your daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs.
Right.
That nasty Bill Shakespeare wrote that line.
Yes.
Sorry if it offended you.
Well, my delicate sensibilities as a woman, the word beast.
So Thomas Bowdler got a hold of this line and he changed it to your daughter and the Moor are now together.
Wow. Wow.
I'm sure you prefer the Bowdler.
I am a fan of Shakespeare in its original form. I haven't read the Bowdler. You've gotten me very curious though to read it.
Let's give a copy to the director of the National Archive.
We should. That's a great idea. And maybe we could have a conversation with the director. I don't know if the director plans to stay in his role, but it would be great to talk Bowdler with the director of the National Archives. That should be the next op talk we do. Errol, I feel like we have not exhausted all the things we need to talk about, but I know we're past the time we asked you for. Can I ask you a last question? Do you have a moment?
Of course.
Moments? Okay, perfect, great. Well, so I'm worried. I guess I'm worried. This is a provocation, I guess. That you've told us about how we can't trust images because people are manipulating them, and yet we know that we need this kind of imagery and footage that we're getting in this moment, right? The fact that you, like so many other Americans, are outraged seeing these images of police violence against Black Americans. Against
any Americans, but yes, in particular Black Americans, yes.
Right, that it's stirring this outrage. And I think one thing that's happening right now that maybe wasn't happening in the time of Abu Ghraib and even, is that social media is driving which images, which footage ends up being thought of as iconic or ends up being, kind of probative. So if we didn't have this imagery of the killing of George Floyd, it's possible to imagine that we wouldn't have the outrage and we wouldn't have the responses to that. And yet you've also told us about how imagery can be manipulated and we need to be inherently skeptical. So I'm worried about a kind of postmodern approach to imagery or to the truth, for that matter, emerging where people don't just, in an era of deep fakes and social media, where people just don't trust what they see anymore at some point. And we're obviously not there yet because people are still able to be they're still capable of being outraged by veritable images.
So we try to correct if this is a misperception. I hope a misperception of what I've said.
No, I'm not saying you said this. I'm just worried about it. And I want to know, are you worried about that? What's the solution?
Photography, the solution is thinking and examining, interrogating, interviewing. It's thinking about the world. Photography, do not get me wrong, provides evidence, significant evidence of the world around us. But you can't read reality off of a photograph without thinking about what it means and how it connects to that world around us. It's a plea for thinking, not for rejecting evidence. Unlike people, I don't believe that evidence can be interpreted any way you choose. But it is evidence, and we need to think about it. We need to think about what it says. And also, we need to deeply think about the human capacity to deny reality, because that actually is the strongest force at work in everything. You can take pictures of a rogue police officer killing an African American, and people can just simply deny what they see before their eyes. They can be members of a jury that acquit. They can look at various kinds of legal boilerplate and say that this doesn't answer to the criteria of murder, first, second, third degree. But we as citizens need to confront material that is. That's why I really love the idea of thinking about photographs. Not rejecting photographs, but thinking about them. Thinking about what they say and what they don't say and what we can learn from them.
Well, thank you for doing that with us today. It's been a pleasure to chat with you and to have you on a Globe Op Talk. Thank you so much for doing this. And thanks for everyone who joined us. And please come back for more. We do these Op Talks. We have a bunch on our website at bostonglobe.com/opinion. And of course, you can follow Globe Opinion on Twitter. And if you're not following Errol and his films and his books, obviously, if you want to know more about this topic, that is the font of knowledge from which to drink. Thanks, Errol.
Ina, thank you so very much.